We're gonna try this monthly. For those that are new to the channel in the past couple months, Swift News is a show that I used to do on a weekly basis where I round up, a lot of blog posts, videos, Twitter posts, put them into a weekly news show and discuss them and share them with you. However, doing that every week for a couple years, it just became a grind and I stopped doing it. But during that time, I, was still following the community, still reading articles. And there were many times where I would read an article or see a video or something and be like, man, that would have been great for Swift News. So that's happened enough times that I'm like, you know what, let's bring it back, but we're gonna do it monthly so it doesn't become a grind and I don't get burnt out on it. As a reminder, links to everything you see in the show will be in the GitHub repo. Link to that repo will be in the description. All right, let's throw up the rundown and get into the show. First up, we have Async Await and the Future of Combine by Ben Shearman. Now I know when I saw this Async Await stuff, that is what came to my mind is like, okay, well, Combine was just announced. What's gonna happen there? And Ben has a full-fledged course on Combine, so he's very familiar with the topic. So I thought this was a great article to share because I think many of you may have had that same question, like what's up with Combine now that we got Async Await? So let's dive in a little bit. And first of all, this isn't going to be a tutorial on Async Await. One, I haven't even dug into it yet, so I don't feel like I can explain it. But two, that's not what this show's about either. But Ben does give a quick overview of what it is, so we'll run through that. Right, this is the old callback way. Many of you may be familiar with these network calls, right? At escaping, you return a result, handle the errors, yada, yada, yada. And then when they're nested, this is what it looks like, right? The example here is getting a location, and then on the success of getting that location, you do another network call, for get location, and then you get the image on that success. So here we are with nested network calls, doing it the old callback way, and he sums it up nicely. Nested completion blocks, each with their own failure path, is a giant pile of yuck. Couldn't agree more. And as he says here, Combine made that much nicer, but we'll come back to that. So the async await way is you mark your functions with async, it actually returns an object. And then when you call them, and again, this is super high level. We're not getting into the weeds here, but just a high level of what you get here, you get these, right? Let location equals try, await, and then you make your network call. Let conditions try, await, and then you make your network call. So it reads nicely top to bottom. Super simple summary, really cleans up our network calls and is a nice way to do this. Combine did something similar, except it was a very steep learning curve, as Ben says himself. That's what led him to create the course. And I can speak from experience. I don't know Combine all that well because I did try to learn it, and that learning curve was steep. And I was like, I don't even really have a great use case to use this. I'm kind of learning it just to learn it. So when I ran into that steep learning curve, I was like, yeah, I'll come back to this when I need it, right? And I moved on. So that is one knock on Combine, even though it can be very powerful. But here's the thing, there was no new stuff for Combine at WWDC 2021. That's a little bit alarming when they have async await that is it's not replacing Combine completely because Combine does have its use cases, but especially things with async sequence, which looks a lot like a Combine pipeline, async stream. So it does appear that a lot of Combine's power is being built into this whole async await new Swift concurrency system. So here's the main event, right? Is Combine going away? And Ben said his previous stance was basically, you should use Combine because it makes complex async code easier to write, reason about, and Apple will support it. Fair enough. But he's now second guessing that statement somewhat. He says, Combine won't go away, at least for a long while, but I think its use may be limited to more functional reactive programming style. And basically it's going to be like a niche use case. And all the stuff that, the vast majority of developers would have used Combine for is now going to be replaced with async await. The other thing here is that async await requires iOS 15. It's not backwards compatible. So that does put the limitation on it that, if you're working on an app that supports iOS 12, iOS 13, even iOS 14, can't use it. Well, I guess you can use it, but then you got to have all those, available conditionals, and that's just a nightmare to deal with. So Combine is still a great way to handle all that complex asynchronous code up until iOS 15 can be your minimum deployment target. So as always, there's no one size fits all answer. If you're building a brand new app today and you do want to support only iOS 15 forward, hey, maybe leave Combine aside and go with async await. But again, most people are going to have to support older OSs, so async await won't be an option for a couple years, so Combine can really step in there. And as I mentioned before, this was just a quick overview of Async Await. However, as always, Paul Hudson's got us covered. He's got a book that's in progress, so it's a work in progress book, but it's still free that you can check out on the internet on this site. Swift Concurrency by example, and as you can see, the intro, the async await. I'm not even gonna go into these. I'll just show you the table of contents, all the stuff. So if you do want the deep dive to start learning about async await and how to use it, here you go. Paul's got you covered. Again, we'll just go into like one example. Typical Hacking with Swift article, and I don't say that in a bad way. That's a good thing. You know what you're going to get if you're used to Paul's content, but he's got you covered if you want to do the deep dive. Plus, there's a ton of other content out there. A lot of the iOS content creators jumped all over this async await. I did not. Next up was one of my favorite announcements from WWDC 2021, and that was the whole new button system, both for UIKit and SwiftUI. And I'm starting with just this image here. This is the actual WWDC video that introduced this, but you can see a lot of the standard buttons that you may have had to create a subclass for, or in SwiftUI, maybe you had your own custom view to make your buttons look like this. I know I tended to do that in my apps because I was going for that Apple look and feel. So for example, this create account button, that would be a custom view in my SwiftUI apps that had the corner radius and the title, formatted, right? Well, now with this new UIKit button system, among other things, right, you can get a lot of the default looking Apple style buttons right out of the box. And here's like a picture that shows you a nice summary of the various types of buttons you can use. So if you're using UIKit, I recommend checking out this talk, right? Meet the UIKit button system. I will link to it. But if you're in SwiftUI, Majid here has got us covered with the many faces of button in SwiftUI, basically showing you the new button stuff that was showcased in that video in SwiftUI. I'll give a couple examples here, right? You can now add a role to a button, like .destructive, which will make it red. Kind of makes sense here. And then we have a couple new things down here, right? We have a button style. Bordered button style here that can give you, again, that basic corner radius. Again, the typical Apple looking button for free out of the box. Let's see, we got tint here. See tint green. That gives it that the same color, kind of that monochrome look where it's, a dark green background with a light green foreground. That's how you know you're always going to get that contrast ratio for accessibility purposes, where if you use maybe a colored background and white letters, for example, yellow background with white letters, that doesn't contrast well. And then some colors like orange, even that doesn't look great. So when you use this tint, you kind of always know you're going to get that contrast ratio. And then the last thing I want to show is the button shape, right? Border button shape. Capsule. Again, I can't tell you how many subclasses of UIButton or custom Swift views that I've created that gave me this, capsule, basically Apple looking button. So again, I like that we get this now basically out of the box. Up next, we have an article from Jeff Hackworth, SF symbol changes in iOS 15. If you're not familiar with SF symbols, another one of my favorite new features, new. It was introduced in iOS 13, so now we're on the third year of it. But basically, I'll go down to this picture real quick just to explain it. Essentially, it's a huge library, huge as in over 3,000 icons to use in your apps. And they're not just icons. They're so flexible. You got multicolored. You'll see all the stuff we can do with them in a second if you're not familiar. But again, introduced in iOS 13, and every year they keep adding features, adding more icons, making it better. So let's see what was added this year. Here we go. Changes in SF Symbols 3. Look, new symbols, over 650 new ones. Again, they added, I think last year they added 700 something. Now they added 600. So a whole bunch of new stuff keeps getting added every year. More multicolor symbols. This is one of my favorite things, is hierarchical and palette rendering. We'll get to that towards the bottom, but let's keep going. Okay, so a bunch of new symbols. By the way, this is Jeff's app, Adaptivity. Very great developer tool, not sponsored. I'm just giving them a free plug because it is a great app if you're an iOS developer. This is just an example of looking at the SF symbols, but you can, see different screen sizes, different accessibility types. It's just a great kind of developer tool to see what's going on your devices, both iPhone and iPad. Okay, plug over. Again, not sponsored or anything like that. I like the app. So anyway, scrolling down here, let's go to the multicolor options here. So here you go, an example of multicolor icons. Now I want to point this out because not all 3,000 plus icons are ready for multicolor. For example, I think it was only a few hundred last year, and they keep adding more as the years go on. So again, an example of multicolor apps. But now let's get to my favorite part here, because again, you can read the article and check it out. So yeah, the multi-layer rendering. So here's an example of, again, that monochrome look where you have two of the same color. One's more maybe lighter in the background, more prominent in the foreground. But these icons now have layers that you can color and configure separately, right? Here's the example. Let me scroll down here, right? So for example, here's an icon of 3 people. Well, you can see you can make each person different color, or the one above here, again, that monochrome look. You can even add gradients to these SF symbols. So again, SF symbols, which also scale with dynamic type. Like I said, calling them just an icon set is a great disservice. They're like icons like taken to the 10th degree. Like, it's crazy. And I'm very thankful for this tool. Before SFSymbols, maybe you did this as well. Spent many a times on sites like Icons 8 or the Noun Project trying to find icons for my apps. Well, again, Apple's got us covered, first party, and again, they're like supercharged icons. So SFSymbols, one of my favorite things Apple does, and they keep making it better every year. And here's what was new this year. To bring the WWDC topics to a close, here is a resource that has all these sample code from every WWDC session video, right? And they're organized, right? Here's all the accessibility. I'll scroll down to, let's go to like ARKit, right? ARKit is down here a little bit. Okay, further than I thought. Augmented reality, right? Building an immersive experience with Reality Kit. Well, if you want to start dabbling in ARKit, you can actually download their code that they used, right? You can see here. This sample code is a project associated with WWDC 21 session. Dive into Reality Kit 2. And I would recommend watching the session, see what they build, then download the project, and now you can poke around in their code and play with it and see what they did. It's actually an Xcode project you can download. Now, quick note, not all of them are tied to one specific session, so you're not gonna get what video they're at by clicking on the sample code for all of them. Because I think some of the projects span across multiple, video sessions, so they can't tie it to just one. But anyway, it's nice that this one you can go watch the video. The other ones you might have to search for the video a little more. But anyway, again, as you saw as I scrolled down this list a lot, tons of Xcode projects from Apple's sample code from WWDC that you can download. Quick note, it is going to require Xcode beta, Xcode 13, iOS 15 type stuff. So quick note on that. But again, if you're learning this new stuff, playing with Apple's sample code is a great way to do that. Moving on, we have the age-old question, is SwiftUI ready? And I think we're going to address this question every WWDC as we get all the new features and SwiftUI matures. But this is an article from Jesse Squires. He put out a Twitter poll. And again, Twitter poll, he'll even admit, not super, scientific, but hey, it is a data point. And you can actually, check out this Twitter thread. I recommend it. Here's the poll, but there's good discussion from a lot of developers about their experiences with SwiftUI. I'm kind of like scrolling down, quickly. You'll get the good and the bad, but let's get back to the article. And I'm just going to walk through the highlights. I recommend checking out yourself. But he says the overwhelming consensus seems to be that SwiftUI is not quite mature enough to write entire apps with it. He says 100% pure SwiftUI TM, because that's kind of like a meme. 100% SwiftUI, and I would agree with it. And then even though it may not have access to all the APIs, like despite this, for scenarios and use cases which SwiftUI works well, it does work very well. It shines. Development is so much quicker. It's very hard to go back to UIKit once you're in those good SwiftUI scenarios, even though, you will have to, the next point, you will definitely have to be comfortable with mixing SwiftUI and UIKit. Apps written in 100% SwiftUI are likely a few years away. Completely agree with that. One of my recent videos about using the photo picker dives into this topic on using UI view controller or UI view representable, how you can use coordinators to basically use UIKit views within your SwiftUI app and communicate between UIKit and SwiftUI. If you have that concept down, you're well on your way to being very comfortable with mixing SwiftUI and UIKit, which, again, anything SwiftUI can't do, you can drop down to UIKit and plug that hole, if you will. And what I like about that, at least the way I structure my code, is that UIKit stuff is very compartmentalized. So if and when there is a SwiftUI native way to do something that it doesn't have yet, in theory, I don't know, we haven't come across this yet, it should be relatively easy to swap out that UIKit component with the native SwiftUI thing, because again, it is nicely compartmentalized. And another point here, one of the largest barriers to adoption is the yearly release cycle, right? So we don't get SwiftUI updates till every year at WWDC. Now, I'm sure Apple has reasons for doing this and not, releasing updates every 3-4 months, every 6 months, whatever. And maybe that is to slow adoption, like intentionally, because it's not, they're still working on it. It's still an early product. So maybe that is an intentional intentional thing to slow adoption, but that is a barrier, to slowing adoptions that it's not going to be updated for another year. So it's like you might as well wait till iOS 16 or something like that. So another good one. But anyway, lots of great points here, but I want to get to the end to kind of sum it up here. And this is my thoughts as well. And not like I'm just agreeing with Jesse. It's just, this is like the consensus. Most people will say this. If you are targeting iOS 14 and above, or especially iOS 15 and above, it's a great time to start experimenting, start implementing SwiftUI in your apps. SwiftUI for iOS 13 was a little rough. So if you do have to support all the way back to iOS 13, you might want to hold off until iOS 14 is your minimum, requirement. And especially if iOS 15 is your minimum requirement, start implementing SwiftUI views. Well, if iOS 15 is your minimum requirement, you're probably building a new app and you might be building a lot of SwiftUI from the start. But either way, it is definitely getting to a very, very good place and it's only going to get better. So if you're supporting minimum iOS 14 or iOS 15, definitely get started. Next up, we have a resource, Swift Programming for macOS. And the first line says it all. There are plenty of books, videos, online resources for developing iOS apps. And that kind of makes sense, right? The vast, vast majority of Swift programmers are building apps for the iPhone, iPad, not so much for macOS. But there is a drought of macOS content, right? Blog posts, articles, videos. So hopefully more resources like this start popping up, mainly for selfish reasons, as I'm about to start dipping my toes into macOS development myself. So maybe I'll start making some videos on that topic. But anyway, you can see the table of contents, just handling some, basic stuff to get you started with Mac OS development. So let's look at the, sidebar navigation, right? So again, pretty standard looking macOS app. Obviously you see this in iPads as well, but this will show you how to create that in SwiftUI for macOS. So again, back up to the table of contents. Oh, long scroll. Maybe we won't go all the way back up, but you can see all the different examples of stuff, again, to get you started with macOS development. Moving on, we have an article from Chris Eidoff called Dependencies, Why We Got Rid of Most Dependencies. And I wanted to share this. We've talked about this a lot on the channel about how, my opinion, which is kind of agreeing with Chris here, is I like to use third-party libraries very sparingly, like almost as a last resort. And he illustrates some of the reasons, right? It's not that I don't like third-party code. However, a lot of the projects I've worked on have been around for quite a few years, which also means keeping their dependencies up to date. Sometimes API breaks, sometimes there's security issues, sometimes the dependency is just not maintained anymore. Very often the dependency stops working when I upgrade my machine. It's just, again, think of the word dependency. You're depending on somebody else's code. So in my opinion, I want to limit that. And maybe I'm scarred from the Swift 2 to Swift 3 conversion. Many of you were probably around for that. You know how much of a nightmare that was. If you weren't around for that, basically Swift 3 had tons and tons of breaking changes in your code. Kind of broke everything. I think the Swift team was like, you know what, let's rip the Band-Aid off now while we're early, because since that major conversion, there haven't been a lot of breaking changes in the Swift updates. So I think that was their chance to just get it all out of the way now. But anyway, it was a huge conversion. Took many people many weeks to do. But that also meant your dependencies had to be converted as well. And maybe that was my fault for wanting to go to Swift 3 right away. Young, naive, early career developer Sean wanted to be on the latest and greatest for their app. The point is you're relying on other people's code. So we'll go down to the summary here. There are many upsides to fewer dependencies, right? You understand the code. It's written in your style. You don't have to spend time keeping the dependencies up to date. You can fix issues yourself without having to wait for something to be approved. For example, yes, a lot of these dependencies are open source. Maybe you submit a PR, maybe they don't review or approve the PR for weeks, and then you got to wait for it to get merged into master, and then it's a mess. Whereas if you wrote it yourself, you have all that. Now, there's downsides as well. For example, the code isn't as battle tested as other code out there. You may not be able to build the feature-rich thing that something that is established can be. So there are trade-offs, of course, as with everything. But I don't know, my take on it is if something takes me a couple days to write myself, I will probably write it myself. And now you may be thinking, oh, you're going to spend a couple days writing something when you could just bring in a library? Save your time, work on something else. And, in certain situations, if you're one developer on a tight deadline, you're right. But there's also an investment into your code base. So a couple days may seem like a lot, maybe in the beginning, but in the long lifetime of your code base, I believe that is a worthwhile investment to not have to deal with all this stuff we talked about with the dependencies. So that's just my take on it. I would love to hear your take in the comments, and definitely check out this article from Chris. Moving on, I have an article from Donnie Walls here, 5 tips to help you become a well-rounded developer. We'll go through these real quick. Tip, read books. I'm not really a book person myself. I like to learn by video, but again, everyone learns differently. But I do like that he recommended just general knowledge on programming principles that comes from books like The Pragmatic Programmer and Design Patterns. I haven't read those books, can't speak to them, but he says none of these books are about Swift or iOS development. So it gives you a broader picture of programming in general programming principles, not so much here's how to build a table view in book form. That's what he's talking about there. Of course, there are books like that, and that does help out, but kind of expand your horizons to think about programming in the bigger picture. Don't rely on tutorials all the time. This goes back to the old tutorial trap that I've been talking about for years. So of course, tutorials, courses, whatever, are a great way to explore something new, or if you're just getting started, but there comes a time where following tutorial after tutorial won't teach you a lot anymore, right? That's the tutorial trap. Now that timing is different for everybody. Maybe after 6 months of courses and tutorials, you start building your own thing, or maybe for you, it's 9 months. That timing is different for everybody. But if you're going on an extreme example here, like 2 years of nothing but courses and tutorials and you haven't built anything yourself, you're doing it wrong. At some point, the training wheels have to come off. So yeah, don't rely on tutorials all the time. Definitely agree with that. Learn to navigate documentation. I get asked to make videos about this all the time, and I've thought about how I would make a video on that. Honestly, I've put a lot of thought into this. I think this just comes with experience and time. It sucks when you're beginning. Reading the documentation is hard. And I remember being there, but the more knowledge you get, the easier the documentation becomes to read and understand. It's kind of like this weird thing. So I just think it just comes with time and experience, and don't be afraid of it from the beginning. Like part of getting that time and experience is like trying to read it, trying to learn it. But I just think this is one of those things that comes with time. Anyway, we'll wrap this up. Participate in the community for sure. I've been recommending Twitter and iOS Dev all the time. If you have local meetups in your area, definitely participate in those. Step outside your comfort zone. That's just a general good advice for life. But definitely check out this article. I know I just skimmed over it, gave my little thoughts on it, but definitely check that out from Donnie. And then finally here we have our Twitter wisdom from Flavio here. I'm pretty sure I shared something like this before, but again, it's been a while for Swift News and I really like stuff like this. But you see it's a chart on code complexity on the left and years of programming on the right. So when you start off, super simple code, and then you start learning things, which can be dangerous. And then, a couple years into your career, maybe you just have all these abstractions, interfaces. I might need this later. This is what the experts do up here. And your code just becomes very convoluted. And, over the years, you learn that doing all that stuff and making your code convoluted and confusing and a steep learning curve for anybody coming into your code base, you learn over time that no, it's very valuable to have super simple code and easy to use, easy to read, easy to expand upon code base is much better than being overly clever. And this is the thing, I want to highlight this I might need this later, because I've fallen into this trap too, where it's oh, well, if we decide, you try to future-proof your code way too much, or premature optimization, right? You're oh, if we do this, I want to be able to expand this way. And in trying to handle all these future what-if cases, your code just becomes extremely convoluted. Whereas 95% of the time, none of those are going to happen. Don't get me wrong, there's a fine line between not future-proofing at all and putting yourself into a box. You don't want to do that, but you can take future-proofing way too far. And I think that's what people do up here at the peak of this curve. So yeah, super simple code is the way to go. But at the same time, I think you do have to go through this pattern of your career to realize why the super simple code is valuable. I think if you just kind of tried to skip this peak here and just kept writing super simple code, you wouldn't really understand the why behind it, and maybe you wouldn't write the code in the right way. So as funny as this is, and I think most programmers go through this pattern, I think it's a necessary career progression. So that wraps up this month's episode of Swift News. Again, we're going to do this the first Monday of every month, so I will see you in September.